Welcome everyone. It's a proud privilege for the Department of Political Science to welcome Professor Catherine Adeni, who is a professor of politics at the University of Nottingham and who is also concurrently holding a position of the director of Asia Research Institute. So we are really happy that and grateful that Professor Catherine could spare her invaluable time to talk to us on power sharing and group representation in India. In fact, the initial idea was that I would invite her to talk to my MA students, MA second semester students, on who I currently teach Indian politics, major issues and debates. The idea was to assess and evaluate Indian democracy and the state in India at large. But somehow, because of the advancement of the summer break, we have not been able to come towards the conclusion of the course. But it is a great pleasure that we have been able to open up this for larger audience, not only to MA students but also to research scholars within the universities as well as outside the universities. I would like to welcome each and every one of you who join us from other universities and other institute. Professor Catherine has worked extensively on politics in South Asia with a major concentration on majoritarianism, on issues of coalition politics, on Hindu nationalism, on comparative federal designs in deeply divided societies around the world. And some of her works have been published in some of the leading academic journals, including Nation and Nationalism, Swiss Political Science Review. You have Political Studies, India Review, Regional and Federal Studies, Representation, Democratization, so on and so forth. And she has also contributed not only in edited books, but also have authored edited book with Lawrence Sage on coalition politics and Hindu nationalism, which was published by Routledge in 2005, and subsequently a monograph on federalism and ethnic conflict regulation in India and Pakistan. And she has prolifically produced or published in cutting edge areas pertaining to these areas of consociationalism, on issues of national identity, majoritarianism, on representation, on democracy at large. So we are very privileged to have Professor Catherine in our midst. We look forward to her lecture, which I think is based on two of our most recent publication, one in the Swiss Political Science Review and another one in Nation and Nationalism. I hope students at the department as well as the audience at large would greatly benefit from one of the brightest minds we have on this area. So over to you, Professor Catherine, and the floor is yours. We'll have you maybe for around 40-45 minutes, then we'll have a question and answer. I request the audience to please post your question in the chat box so that we have a seamless question and answer session after the lecture. So Professor Catherine, it's yours. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Suwan. It's an absolute pleasure to have been invited today to speak. It's been too long since I've been able to be in India because of the, the COVID pandemic, and I really hope that you and all of your families are well. We're now doing much better in the UK, but I'm watching India and seeing the stories come out of my friends being affected, and I just keep my fingers crossed that you and your loved ones are all safe and well. The last time I had the pleasure to be at Hyderabad University was in 2015, which was when we held a conference on Indian federalism as part of the Leverhulme project that myself and Professor Suwan were involved in. And I'm going to share my screen with you now, and I'm going to show you a picture. Oh, host disabled participant screen sharing. Are you able, Anga, to allow me to share my screen?
Yeah, I just did. I think you should be able to share.
Let me see if I can do it now. There we go. Let's see if we can do this.
Yes, we can see your screen now.
Yeah, excellent stuff. Right, so yeah, this was the last time I was in Hyderabad. Unfortunately, I didn't find a picture of Professor Suwan at that event, but you can see there some of your other professors, Professor Kailash and Professor Suri, in those pictures, as well as me in the blue there. Most of what I'm going to say today is going to be based on joint research that I've conducted with Professor Wilfred Surenden from the University of Edinburgh. And this is this gentleman here in the blue shirt at the head of the table. And I'm going to talk to you today about power sharing and group representation in India, based on a new data set that I collected and which enabled us to analyse these power sharing dynamics over time in India. Because one of the things that, of course, you talk about is you've got to look at India over time. You can't just take one particular snapshot because it's changed so much since independence. So, why is power sharing important? This is a question that lots of authors have looked at in many different countries, trying to understand how does democracy in deeply divided societies survive? And there's a whole host of authors who, like Gabriel Allman back in the 1950s and 60s, who were saying that you needed to have a homogeneous society for democracy to work. And anyone who knows anything at all about India knows that that doesn't apply to India. But yet India, yes, there are problems and issues with democracy at the moment, but India had the title of being the world's largest democracy, despite the fact that it had incredible diversity along religious lines, along linguistic lines, along caste lines, along regional lines. I could go on. And the answer a person called Aaron Leitpart came up with. And he wasn't writing about India at that time, but he was writing about countries like the Netherlands in Europe, Belgium, Switzerland, countries that had high levels of linguistic and religious diversity, but still managed to have stable democracies. And he was asking, how does this work? Why are these the exception? Why do these not collapse as somebody like Gabriel Allman would have predicted? And the consociationalist answer, which is essentially a formal form of power sharing, is that there's power sharing across 4 dimensions within the governing system. And the first of these is a grand coalition. So where you bring the leaders of different political parties who represent the different groups in society together. And this is a picture from the former Northern Ireland executive in Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom. And these 2 women, Arlene Foster in the red, and I always forget the name of the Sinn Féin representative. These are the leaders of 2 completely opposed political parties. Sinn Féin arguing for the independence of Ireland and rejoining Northern Ireland to the Irish Republic, and Arlene Foster representing a party that wants very strongly to maintain its links to the United Kingdom. But here they are as First Minister and Joint First Minister. A mutual veto. where groups have the right to protect interests that they hold to be dear to them, whether that be religious laws, whether that be control over education, proportionality, and in government appointments. And this could be in the coalition itself, or it could be in the bureaucracy, or it could be in the military. And then finally, segmental autonomy, areas where groups have control over things that matter to them. And this could be done territorially, and I'll apply this to the Indian case in a minute. So, for example, linguistic provinces, as India introduced, control over language in the education system, or it can be done on a non-territorial basis. For example, the right of different religious groups in Nigeria, regardless of where they are in the country, have the right to maintain their own personal laws. And of course, we see that at the moment, at least, in India. So India, however, has been a challenge for consociational theory. It's obviously had a very majoritarian electoral system. It's adopted the so-called first past the post, but more accurately known as simple plurality electoral system. And this, in most other countries, has not been conducive to power sharing. In India, it's worked, but as I'll go on to talk about, because the groups are so linguistic groups anyway, are very territorially concentrated. It's had no, or at best partial, formal constitutional guarantees to allow any of those four elements that Aaron Leitpart talked about. In terms of no grand coalition, it's simply the leader of the largest political party who decides who is going to, form the government. There's no mutual veto. Again, it's all a majoritarian political system. There are elements of proportionality for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes within the constitution, but they're not there for linguistic groups, and they're not there for linguistic groups. And there are elements of segmental autonomy in terms of linguistic reorganization of states. But there's no segmental autonomy for many other groups, as I'll come and talk about in a minute. So Leitpart said, how does India work? Why is India an exception to my model? And he argued, no, it wasn't. He said India actually confirmed his theory. And he did so because, especially in the first decades after independence, you do have caste-based reservations, as I've just talked about. You have the personal laws for Muslims and Christians, although obviously not for Sikhs and Jains, are protected. And you had the linguistic reorganization of states in the 1950s, 1960s, and then going on in the 1970s along more tribal lines in the northeast of India. So he said, actually, under Nehru, this was an informal consociation. And after the decline of the Congress system and the internal accommodation of diversity, India has become less consociational. There's been less power sharing in India. Now, myself and other colleagues have questioned this. People like myself, Stephen Wilkinson and Ian Lustig, the latter two scholars based at Yale and the University of Pennsylvania, say actually India became less consociational after independence. And we do so for a number of reasons. So we look at the fact that, for example, reserved seats were removed from the Constitution of India after independence. These were reserved seats for the Muslim and religious communities. Although, as said, they were retained for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Rather than the Congress Party being representative of the diversity of India, we talk about the fact that, well, this was a very elite organisation. These were tokenistic representatives, rather than being representatives that were really coming up from the communities themselves. We point to the fact that, in fact, yes, minorities were there, but they weren't really in positions of power. And I'll show you some data in a minute on the position of minorities within the Indian cabinet. So in general, you don't have minorities being represented within the core cabinet positions. And many minority demands were ridden roughshod over. So, for example, one example of this would be the fact that Hindi was adopted in the Devanagari script rather than in the Roman script. And we see a decline of Urdu after independence, partly as a result of this. So what Wilfred and I sought to do in our paper was to make three kind of arguments. One is that, contrary to Aaron Leitpart, India didn't function as a formal power sharing system, between 1952 and 1989. However, after the demise of the one-party system and the Congress Party, Indian democracy became a lot more consociational. And as said, I'll go through some data to look at this shortly, especially in relation to the accommodation of caste and also the accommodation of territory, region, and language. However, we know that the decline of the Congress Party has gone hand in hand with the, the rise of the BJP and the restoration of single party government since 2014. This has negatively impacted on some religious minorities, especially the Muslim communities of India. So to talk about the first of these, so we assessed using a data set that we collected ourselves, but also with the help of the Trivedi Centre for Data at Ashoka University. We looked at the Grand Coalition element of Aaron Leitpart. So this is Nehru's first cabinet, which featured members from every religious community. It's not doing too well on gender representation, it must be said, as you can see from that picture. What we did was we then calculated how many seats different people from different religions had in the cabinet over time. And I'm going to show you a picture of that, a slide of that, showing the ways in which different religious communities have been represented. And what we've done is we've calculated the deviation of proportionality from their share of the population. So if they get if they're represented completely in relation to their proportion of the population, then they get essentially a score of 0. If they're overrepresented, then they would show a higher level. So if I show you this this table here, You can see in 1947 to 52, that first picture that I showed you, you can see here that Hindus are slightly underrepresented according to their proportion of the representation. Muslims are slightly underrepresented, but generally it's quite good. There's not that much deviation from proportionality. Groups tend to be represented roughly in accordance to their percentage of the population. And you can see that under the Nehruvian system in 52 and 57, you can see that actually there was more minorities were represented than Hindus. So he was trying, it seems to look like, that minorities were being overrepresented, possibly to bring those communities into the political system. But you can see how this changes over time. So you can see once we move into, for example, the 1989 period, the era of coalition politics, it's more of a mixed picture, but you can see that suddenly Hindus become a lot more over-represented according to their share of the population, compared to Muslims, who, as you can see with the bars here, become much more underrepresented. And this becomes much, much more pronounced under the BJP governments. So this enables us to track over time the fact that the Grand Coalition was functioning, you know, in terms of deviation from proportionality, actually much more under the Nehruvian regime. But now, under this regime, in the last, you know, kind of 10, 20 years, you see much more Hindu overrepresentation according to their percentage of the population. And let's not forget that Hindus are 80%, you know, of the population of India now. Whereas Muslims, with, you know, 14, 15% of the population, are not achieving that representation in the Union cabinet. If then we look at the religious breakdown of those cabinet positions, you can see here that you have Muslims have never held, for example, the position of finance minister. They've never held a position of defense minister. There have been 3 Muslim external affairs ministers, and this is something that has changed and has become, you know, under coalition politics in the 1989. You've seen an increase in minority representation. And again, you can see with Christians and Sikhs, there have not been that many representatives of, for example, external affairs. There's been no Christian home minister, no Christian external affairs minister either. If we look on the caste side, however, you can see that there's actually a much stronger deviation from proportionality than there is on the basis of religion. You can see that the forward castes, you know, a much smaller percentage of the population, are vastly overrepresented in cabinet positions compared to the backward castes. Scheduled castes and scheduled tribes are much more likely to be much closer to proportion of population in the cabinet. But you can see that there's a massive underrepresentation of the OBCs and a massive overrepresentation of the forward castes. On the basis of region, you can see that there's, you know, a very, very mixed picture. Generally, the East and the Northeast has not done as well in the cabinets. But as you can see, this has changed markedly over time. If we move on to the second of Aaron Leitpart's points, a mutual veto. You have seen elements of a mutual veto within the Indian system. And this has been much more on an informal basis. So this is a newspaper cutting talking about the language riots in Tamil Nadu and the, well, Madras state as it was then, now the state of Tamil Nadu, demanding that English not be removed as a link language. And, you know, the proposition was that English would be a link language for 15 years and then Hindi would replace it. Of course, when we get to 1965, this is a big issue. This is really hitting people's identity politics, but it's also hitting potential for job opportunities for their children, for their community. And so that you see that a mutual veto operates informally, but again, it's not something that's codified in the Constitution. Again, when we see the Shah Bano protests, we see this again happening. We see that Christian and Muslim personal laws were retained within the Constitution, which gives the right of particular bodies to have a say over those personal laws. But we also know that that is something that can be, and we've seen in recent years with the abolition of, you know, the triple talaq. This is something that can be changed without the wishes of the personal law boards in question. Now, whether that's the right thing to do or a wrong thing to do is something that I'm not addressing in this particular presentation. Now, the Shah Bano case of 1986, which you know as well as I do, reinforced the mutual veto, with the Muslim communities essentially getting Rajiv Gandhi to reverse almost the Supreme Court decision, which gave alimony to Shah Bano. But as I've said, the triple talaq case of 2017 and then the actual change in the law potentially challenges this. Now, why do I put a question mark there? The reason I put a question mark there is the question is, who decides these matters within a community? You know, we know that triple talaq has been opposed by many Muslim women groups, for example. There is no community cohesion on maintaining triple talaq. But as several commentators have written about, you know, the punishments for triple talaq of 3 years imprisonment are much higher than for other communities when wives have been abandoned. So there's a mixed story there. In terms of cow protection policies, in recent years, again, we've seen an attempt to change the law on this, not just at state level, but we see the 2017 law, which the Supreme Court then kind of shut down and said that it discriminated, it disadvantaged too many people. So whether that will come back in or not is open to question. But we do know that there has been a lot of violence associated with this, both before the most recent election, but also after that. In terms of language policies, we know that there is the protection of regional majority languages. We saw that with the construction of linguistic states in the 1950s and 60s, although we must remember that this was opposed by Nehru. He thought that this was a dreadful idea. and the Linguistic Reorganisation Commission accepted this, but it was not accepted really on the basis of language. They were talking about things like administrative efficiency rather than actual linguistic identity politics in their acceptance of this. As said, we see the maintenance of English as a link language between particularly the north and the south, but also the northeast of the country. We've seen so far anyway, the protection of the representation of the southern states who have overrepresentation in the Lok Sabha according to their population size. But as I said, things are changing, and we've also seen more recent rise of the promotion of Hindi. And there's a lot of dispute about how far this could go, how far this should go. But we know that this, if it is pushed, you know, the promotion of Hindi over any other of the other national languages, really, you know, would be very, very worrying from a power sharing point of view in India. And we've seen, of course, the entrenchment of caste reservations, and as we saw just before the last election, actually the extension of these caste reservations by the Modi government. So if we turn to proportionality, sorry, I just need to check my time. There we go, I'm okay. In terms of proportionality, we've seen, for example, that there are reservations in central government jobs. And the data on this is a bit mixed. Some of it's easy to collect, some of it is harder to collect. What we've shown here is that if you look at the dark bars, if you look at you know, scheduled caste Hindus in central government jobs, in 1965, you can see that there's, you know, massive underrepresentation according to population in the elite, you know, kind of category A civil service ICS jobs. This has gradually got better over time as the reservations have kicked in and the policies of reservation have been brought in over Indians' independent history. We've seen it's worked much better with the lower paid jobs, however. So this is why it's so important to disaggregate the data and not just look at what is the representation of scheduled castes in central government jobs. You've got to look at where they're employed. There's a much higher proportion employed in the D grade category as opposed to the A grade category. If we look at the deviation from proportionality in the Lok Sabha, again, you can see that there's this massive disparity. It's not worked very well as a proportional consociation. And you can see there again, forward castes are much more overrepresented according to their population, as opposed to you know, the backward, the OBCs. And if you have a look moving, this has got slightly better through independent India's history, but there's not a huge change. We can see, however, that as I showed you on the other chart, Muslim representation has got much worse. Scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, because of those reservation policies, are doing much better in relation to their proportion of the population. Again, indicating the importance, if you want to have a consociation, of formal power sharing mechanisms and formal constitutional measures rather than just informal ones. Religious representation in key institutions has, however, been again mixed. So you can see that Muslims have done very well in kind of positions of, what's the word, the politics of presence, the symbolic representation in terms of, you know, being president, for example, but certainly not in terms of being chief of army staff or even the speaker of the Lok Sabha. Sikhs have done much better according to their percentage of populations. Christians and others are kind of bobbling around roughly where they should be. If we look at the regional representation, again, you can see that the north is much more overrepresented in the Chief of Army Staff, and the west of the region of the west as well, whereas the northeast is, interestingly actually, around about where it should be in relation to its proportion of population. The south is slightly underrepresented, and the east and the central regions massively underrepresented in there. So again, that you can see that the power sharing isn't working in terms of certain regions compared to others. If now we move on to segmental autonomy. As said, India is an example of a strong success in its territorial autonomy in certain areas of its federation, at least. So we know there's been linguistic reorganisation, the Official Languages Act of 1967, which stopped the imposition of Hindi as the only single official language. The special status of Kashmir has obviously been removed, but asymmetric federalism, as Professor Housing has written about, and the sixth schedule in the northeast of India is alive and well. President's rule has challenged this territorial autonomy, but actually this has been much less frequently imposed since the Bommai judgment of 1994. Obviously, this is of little consequence if you're sitting in the Union territory of Jammu and Kashmir at the moment, but the biggest time President's rule was imposed was actually under Indira Gandhi, and you see her politicised use of President's rule very much so underneath her tenure of power. In terms of non-territorial autonomy, as said, you've got the personal laws for Muslims and Christians, which is constitutionally enshrined, and linguistic minorities have constitutional protections as well. However, this is to a large extent on paper. It's something that when you read the official languages reports of the different states to the Linguistic Minorities Commission, well, many states don't even bother responding and sending reports, which shows how seriously or otherwise they actually treat this issue. So, as said, India has been generally majoritarian after independence. But what's really interesting to see is that, contrary to someone like Aaron Leitpart, it's actually after Congress, it's after you know, the decline of the one-party dominant system, that India has appeared to become a lot more consociational. So we've looked at and we've demonstrated how the other backward caste representation has increased somewhat, not enough. The scheduled caste contingent again has increased. despite upper caste resentment, despite the protests we see against educational reservations and the Mandel report. But there's obviously still a long way to go, as we see in those data that we presented in terms of the representation in the cabinet and in terms of the representation in the Lok Sabha. As said, it's more evident, and the rise of the plebeians, this is a phrase of Christophe Jaffrelot, is a lot more evident in lower political offices. So it's much less evident in the cabinet system. And it does appear to have stalled in recent years. Excuse me. And the thing I'm going to kind of conclude on is that we do see a decline in the presence of religious minorities, especially Muslims, in the institutions of state. And one of the things that really struck me is in comparing the outcomes, for example, of the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribe communities to that of the Muslim communities within India. And you can do this on, socioeconomic grounds. You can look at literacy rates, you can look at education rates, infant mortality rates. And it's quite interesting to see that the Muslim minorities, although the population has been increasing, their socioeconomic status has not, and in many cases is a lot worse actually than scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, which leads me to wonder, is this anything to do with the fact that they lost the reservations? They lost the reservations and having political parties and representatives who could speak for them. Now, we know under the Nehruvian era, we saw that Muslims were overrepresented in the cabinet. But this comes back to my point. Who are the representatives? Are they representatives who are coming up from below? Are they representatives who are really representing, their community? Because consociation and power sharing really relies on having people who understand their communities and can bring their communities along with them. Now, the final point, and I'll stop sharing my screen now. The final point I kind of wanted to end on was to talk about what's happening in India today. And as Professor Housing said, I've also published recently in Nations and Nationalism, and I'm very happy to share copies of either of these articles with you if you want to send me an email or send me a tweet. I will do so. And one of the things that I've been interested in looking at is the way in which the Muslims in particular have been undermined by the Modi regime. And we do see this as, this will come as no surprise to any of you, of course. We see this in terms of representation, with the only Muslim members of Modi's cabinet being the Minister for Minority Affairs. We see this in terms of the level of, kind of discourse, what's acceptable to say about Muslims by cabinet ministers who aren't reprimanded for their remarks. We see this in the absence of condemnation of attacks on Muslims, or complete silence about, the killing of people like Muhammad Akhlaq in Uttar Pradesh. So, of course, the VDEM report has been very controversial in India, and, it's downgrading India to the status of an electoral autocracy. But I propose that it's actually better understood as being, an ethnic democracy, one where, you know, the rights of one community are privileged over another community. And we've seen so many changes in recent years. Obviously, the abolition of the special status of Jammu and Kashmir and its downgrading to a union territory with Ladakh being split off, but also things like the Citizenship Act and the changes that we've seen there are much more reminiscent of states which do have a differentiation in not citizenship necessarily for their communities, but in the rights that certain groups have within the state. And I will end by saying that one of the reasons I started working on this in India and looking at India as a level, or as an ethnic democracy, was precisely because many of the things that I saw in India when I first came there 20, 25 years ago, and the way that people were talking about the Muslim communities then. And I remember thinking, this would never happen in the UK. I was young and naive at that point. And sadly, now we do see this kind of discourse being bandied about in the UK. We see it being bandied about in America. We see it being bandied about in many European states, Australia too. And so what I wanted to do in that article was to try and understand where the danger points were. What should we look at to understand when a state was becoming an ethnic democracy? Because sadly, I don't think this is going to be confined to India. I think that this is spreading across the world. So with that rather controversial point, I will now end. Thank you very much for attending. I really do appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Catherine, for your very insightful presentation. I'm yet to get a question posted in the chat box. So before, in fact, people think about or think through the type of question that they might like to ask you, let me just, for the sake of being an icebreaker, ask you maybe a set of questions. One is, uh, you talk about the centrality of representation in your overarching framework and how more than the formal, representational scheme of things, how the informal representation, in fact, drive the nature of consociationalism. So, given that this nature of representation is also driven by a set of factors, one of which is the nature of political culture or the kind of role that political parties play in terms of giving representation when it comes to elections, which are not mandated upon formally. Do you think that given now that you have the BJP with its majoritarian impulse, which excluded minorities, which of course is represented in your graphic representation of how this proportionality works out. Do you think, in your assessment, that the nature of centralized party system that the BJP now seeks to entrench in Indian political system would somehow dissolve over time, given now that there is a kind of general assessment that the BJP is now towing the line of the Congress in terms of including or accepting membership from factional leaders, not only from the Congress but across political parties. Do you think that because of this politics of factionalism in the future, the idea of or the nature of informal representation might change, which might in turn redefine the nature of party being more accommodative in the long run, and how this shore up the nature and content of consociationalism in India in the short as well as in the long run? What is your assessment on this?
I think that is a really, really good question. The optimist in me would say that the BJP has only been so successful by, as you say, moving into different areas, trying to address local issues. We see this, you know, in Assam. We saw that in West Bengal. We see it, you know, coming in Karnataka. It's only really going to be that mass, you know, kind of political party, the successor to Congress, if it can accommodate all groups within Indian society. The pessimist in me notes that so much of the BJP's strength still is based in those northern Hindi heartland states because of the way that the federation is structured. We know that there are calls to have a redistribution of those seats in the Lok Sabha. Is the North going to become even more privileged and the South, you know, given something in return, maybe in the Finance Commission? And we also see, as said, things like the promotion of Hindi, which comes and goes, but is something that really, really worries me. And we still see the communalisation of politics. And I think you may see an accommodation of caste, you may see an accommodation of region and language, but I don't think we're going to see an accommodation of religion. And this is, you know, affecting other political parties as well. We see, and this is work done by people such as Gilles Vernier at Ashoka, you know, that actually it's not, you know, the regional parties didn't field Muslim candidates in winnable seats either. So this has been something that's been long-standing in Indian politics. Muslims have been unrepresented throughout India's independence history. It is getting worse now. But I don't think that the BJP is going to need the Muslim communities to come to power. So I don't think you're going to see any significant accommodation. I'm going to be the pessimist today.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. There is a direct question from one of the audience which asks, which is of course not visible to all of you, which asks that although representation in the Lok Sabha remains steady till 2014, although the representation to the Lok Sabha has diminished over time in the Lok Sabha till 2014, on the other side, there has been a steady representation of states or minorities in the Rajya Sabha. So what possibly explain this, paradox? How do you see this?
When he or she asks about, is it minorities in terms of religious minorities or is it regions?
It's like religious minorities, Muslim representation especially.
I am going to hold my hands up and say I don't have data on that, but that is obviously something I need to look at. My first, and thank you for that. My first point would be to say that this would fall much more into the politics of symbolism rather than the politics of power. You know, in the same way that you've had Muslim presidents of India having people who are representing in the Rajya Sabha, it's a much less powerful institution. And that if there is much more representation there for minorities, and as said, I haven't seen that data and I really should do because it's important. It's probably, I would say, because representation there matters less. But it's an interesting question. If there is the same representation according to percentage of population, why is that? That's something I can't give an answer to now, but it's a really important question I will give thought to. So thank you.
Yeah, any more question? People seems to be very hesitant to ask. So is there anyone among you who want to ask direct question?
I would love to hear from you. I really would love to be there in person and have you, you know, kind of give me your questions. So please do.
Yeah, please feel free to ask directly if you feel like. Yeah, there is a question from David. Yeah, the promotion of Hindi is constitutionally permitted, and therefore it would continue to breed and exist. What to do in that context? How to dodge this promotion of Hindi? And there is this question by Nilanjan, which asks, though consociationalism seems not to be strong in India, and the data too indicates towards not quite a balanced power sharing, but there is a possibility that the regional tiers, that is the states and the panchayats with their representations, have balanced this disproportion. At times, a local councillor, sarpanch, or local MLA matters more for people than the union cabinet. Is there any data on this?
Great. Yeah, great questions. So on the first one, I mean, English is guaranteed as a joint official language. How to dodge the promotion of Hindi? I think that whenever any attempts are made, as we see when, you know, Modi will go and speak to, you know, children in Tamil Nadu or, you know, kind of Telangana in Hindi rather than Tamil or, you know, Telugu, I think that rightly there needs to be, you know, a big hoo-ha about this. People need to protest. People need to say this is not acceptable. It's often said, and you know, I hear you know, said a lot, well, everyone understands Hindi, they all watch Bollywood films, why is this an issue? It completely ignores it's not just about the intelligibility of language. It's also about the rights of that language and the rights of that language to be equal to Hindi. And that's why they are there as national languages. That's why India has 22 national languages, which my students, you know, in the UK, when I talk about, you know, get them to design a fictional constitution, and they all get up in arms, oh, we can't possibly have 3 national languages. And I say, do you know how many languages India has? And they're always amazed. They just cannot compute that this could work. But it obviously does. And I get myself into enormous trouble when I go to your neighbor in Pakistan and I talk about, you know, how well India has done with recognizing and accommodating its linguistic diversity. So my advice on the, you know, the promotion of Hindi is push back, push back, push back. That's, I think, the only thing that, you know, people can do, because if they seriously go for the promotion of Hindi, obviously they're going to upset the balance of power on their attempts to, you know, get states like Tamil Nadu or Karnataka, you know, in the future. Nilanjan, you're right. What's the union cabinet to most people? It's irrelevant in a large manner of things. I would say two things. I think it does matter, because if you don't have representatives at the top speaking for a community, that's something that then the policies that trickle down to the state levels and to the local levels often miss out what those communities need. You need to have effective representation there. And I'm not convinced that having somebody who just has the interests of those communities at heart, but hasn't got that lived experience, is going to do so as effectively. There's also the politics of presence in terms of people seeing somebody, you know, a high profile person from their community up there at the top in that picture with the Prime Minister. Don't underestimate that power in allowing the aspiration of people from whatever community, whether it be language, whether it be religion, whether it be tribe, whether it be caste. It makes a huge difference. But you ask about the point about the states. Certainly in terms of Muslim underrepresentation, Christophe Jaffrelot has done some excellent work on this, and Muslims are much underrepresented at the state level as well. We know they're massively underrepresented in the bureaucracies at state level, and they're massively underrepresented in the police forces as well. At the same time, we know that Muslims are overrepresented in terms of how many of them are arrested and then not charged. So I don't have the data on the panchayats, I'm afraid. That's again something that's really important. But we do see this at lower levels too. It's not just the union cabinet.
Yeah, thank you, Adani. There are two set of questions. One is on the rise of women representation. How do you see this work out or pan out in terms of your framework? Second, as India moves towards ethnic democracy, do you think that we are moving away from democracy? And the third is that if you were to expand, your analytical focus to cover offices other than the speaker, the president, chief of army staff, etc., you may find more Muslim representation, say, for example, in the governors. So this is symbolic, but nonetheless important. So how do you see this?
Thank you. Some really challenging and excellent questions. Okay, so the first question on women's representation. Other people, such as, Carol Sperry and Shirin Rai have worked on this much, much better than I have. I would say, though, that my arguments, it would equally apply. So the politics of presence, that symbolic representation, people seeing women there makes a difference in terms of people aspiring, thinking, I can do that. I can be that person. I can be that woman. And if women aren't there, then you're not going to have that aspiration. The same for things like making governance, making policies that work for women. Unless you've got women in the room, I'm becoming increasingly persuaded that you won't get the culture change and you won't get the policies that you need. And there is rightfully a worry that it will be, upper caste women who will, take on these positions. But as we can see in the Lok Sabha at the moment, it's already dominated by the forward Hindu communities there and the castes there. So I think that that's something we do need to consider. But I would certainly be a supporter of the Women's Reservation Bill. Sorry, what was the second question? Was that in moving towards ethnic democracy? Are we moving away from democracy?
Yeah, that is the question. Yeah.
So that's a really good question. Sami Smuha, who proposed the notion of an ethnic democracy, he did so in relation to Israel. And he argued that in Israel, you have the Palestinians who are known as Israeli Arabs. And they are states, they are citizens of Israel, but they do not in practice have the same rights as non-Arab citizens, so Jewish Israeli citizens. He argued very strongly that this was still a democracy. It's not taking away, for example, the right to vote, the rights of, freedom of expression, but they were seen as being kind of second-class citizens, even within this democratic framework. Now, India today, I think two separate things are going on. I think we are seeing the pushback, obviously, against Muslims and Muslim rights. We've seen a massive increase in those who respond to the National Election Survey, saying that they are, democracy means the will of the majority community, which means, the Hindus. But at the same time, we've also seen a massive crackdown on media freedom. And that obviously affects, everyone in India. It doesn't just affect Muslim communities. So the VDEM report is much more focused on things like freedom of expression and media freedom than it is about the rights of minorities, although that is part of it. I think the problem is that you can have democracy and have intolerance against minorities. And I think that, for me, is what worries me about what's happening in the United Kingdom at the moment, and in France, and in the Netherlands, and in the United States, because you have this populist nationalism that is essentially saying, we, the people, have rights, and you are not the people, or you have less rights because you're not one of us, in quotation marks. And you see this against, Muslims, but other communities as well, within many countries in Europe, America, and Australia. So sadly, I think that becoming an ethnic democracy is compatible with democracy. But what's happening with India at the moment, there's two things going on. There's, and they are obviously linked, but they didn't necessarily have to be, I think would be my point. In terms of the governors, yeah, that's again a great point. I don't have data on that. I would be interested to see, where these governors come from, which parties they belong to. But again, it would be good to look at that. So I've made a note to go and do that. But I don't have any, kind of immediate response now. But thank you for that.
Yeah, Catherine, let me check the time with you. Are you fine to extend another question, another couple of set of questions?
Mm-hmm. That would be great.
Yeah, fine then. Yeah, so we'll proceed. First is this question which asks, how do you see AI, AIMIM response to rising majoritarianism? Do you think that this is equally ethnic? How do you see it? That's the first question. The second question is that although there is a steady decrease in the causal relationship between ethnic democracy with majoritarianism as well as coalition government, how do you see this, right? And the third is in terms of deviation from proportionality, although this is more or less proportionate to the demographic of SC and ST, there seems to be quite a disproportionate deviation vis-a-vis the OBC, right? So given this, do you think that the way forward should be on debating uh, instead of underrepresentation, emphasis on procedural justice and citizenship rights? How do you then compensate underrepresentation given the lack of former basis of reservation in representation of Muslim in India?
Thank you. So Rizwan's point first. I'm really interested by the AIMIN. I haven't had a chance, because of COVID and teaching, to kind of do a lot of work on this yet. I think that, he's obviously been an, very impressive political orator. And that's part of, the explanation for the success. The problem with consociation is, and the problem with formal power sharing is, it does entrench divides within a political system. And some people think that this is really not a good idea, because, as you say, this is equally ethnic. And that was one of the points, that was one of the reasons why Nehru and Patel were so, opposed to the idea of reserved seats for Muslims in the constitution of an independent India, because it was entrenching this ethnic divide. And they had a version of civic nationalism. Everyone was Indian. They weren't, it didn't matter what religion you were. We were going to represent Indians equally. That's an entirely laudable aim. The problem is that it hasn't worked out for the Muslim communities. And as I said, if you look at the socio and economic data presented in the Sachar Commission report and in any of the human development reports, you can see that that's a problem. The other issue, though, is if you're going to have reservations, when you had reservations for Muslims before partition in the Government of India Act 1935, that was 30%, 33% of the population. That's a big enough reservation to really make a difference. Would a reservation of 10, 14%, how much difference would that make? If you compare that, that would be roughly akin to the scheduled caste reservation. Would it make a material difference, given that it is a much smaller percentage of the population? But it would definitely be an ethnic, an ethnic division being represented within the Indian constitution. And there's obviously no sign that that's going to happen any time soon. I'm sorry, what was the next question, Suhan?
You see, the next question is, in terms of deviation from the principle of proportionality, this does not seem to be very starkly evident in the case of scheduled caste and scheduled tribes.
Oh, yeah. No, I've got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think that, you can see that the OBC representation does increase. It certainly goes up until about 2004. Certainly much better. So I'm looking at the data now. It goes up to, kind of under 20% deviation of proportionality, which is much better than the under 30% deviation from proportionality in the first elections of 1951, 52. But then in 2009 and 2014, it's kind of back down again to about 25%. And I think it's even worse in the 2018 Lok Sabha. So what's the answer to that? Obviously, we've seen issues over reservations. I guess the logic of my argument would be that political parties should have lists where they have, a certain percentage of candidates from different communities on there. That's something that was tried in Lebanon, for example. You would then have to address the question of, well, would those particular parties be given, those particular candidates be given winnable seats? That's the other thing that we see, is that sometimes parties will give seats to Muslims or OBCs or scheduled castes, but they're not in winnable seats. So they're kind of hitting the politics of presence, but they're not actually leading to any increase in representation.
Okay, so we have this question from someone who asks, I read in today's article in Hindu newspaper that Muslim voter choice in recent elections reflected secular standpoint in choosing their party to vote. Madam, do you think if Muslims continue to take a secular view to choose party, or they prefer party that represents their religion? I have MIM in question.
I think that, Muslims will vote for, who they think will, as anyone votes, who is going to protect them, who is going to provide secure economic livelihood. And that's going to vary depending on where you are in India. So, if you're in, for example, Hyderabad, you may vote very differently than you will if you are in Lucknow, where you might be much more likely to vote for the Samajwadi Party because they have much more chance of coming to power. They're articulating that they are going to support Muslim interests, and in power they may well have done so. So I think, he obviously has a national ambition to kind of get this Muslim vote over all of India. It certainly, it hasn't worked so far in independent India's history. It may work, but I have my doubts. I think that the Muslim voter is going to be a lot more savvy depending on which part of India that they're in, who's actually going to be able to deliver for them. And that's, as with any other voter, who's got the most chance of coming to power.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. For the last question, I think this question is by Adil, one of our MA students, and he asked, should the debate on underrepresentation be replaced by emphasis on procedural justice and citizenship rights? And do you think it could somehow compensate underrepresentation given the lack of formal basis of reservation in representation for Muslim in India?
I think, as I said, the idea of citizenship rights and the idea of everyone being treated equally under the law is a brilliant aim. The problem is that sometimes when certain groups are disadvantaged, you need to treat people unequally so that everyone can compete on the same level playing field. And I think a position I'm coming to is, and I'm still working this through in my head, but it does seem that looking at the removal of reservations or the removal of, I think the removal of reservations is one of the things that has affected the Muslim communities in India. If you compare their socioeconomic status to that, for example, of the scheduled castes in particular. If you've got equality of rights, that's fine if everyone has the equal chance to access them. It's fine if you have equality and a level playing field. But as you know about with the debates about justice in India, there is no level playing field for so many communities. And that's why you see this, the forward castes are still the ones who are overrepresented in the Lok Sabha, in the cabinet, despite the fact that everyone talks about, India's full of, all the OBCs are coming to power. India, there is an OBC prime minister. Well, I think our data shows that, India, a lot of groups just aren't competing from the same level playing field. And hopefully that's something that will change over time. But I think the Indian example, especially with the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, shows that reservation, it's not a perfect policy, but it certainly has achieved a lot for some communities.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Catherine, for comprehensively answering the probing questions asked by the participants. Let me also thank the participants for their active participation in this lecture by yours. May I now request Dr. Anaga to propose a vote of thanks, and we will be concluding the session for now. Yeah, thank you. Over to you, Anaga, please.
Thank you, Professor Swan. So, Professor Adeni, thank you so much for sharing your very important and edifying research with us. It was a joy to listen to you. So I thank you on behalf of the Department of Political Science for the lecture and for being so generous with your time, especially with the questions. I also thank all the audience members, most of them are students, for actively participating in this event and taking the discussion forward. As Professor Adeni has said, if any of you are interested, you can write to her for her articles, etc. And we hope that this discussion, we keep continuing this discussion. So yeah, thank you so much.
No, and thank you so much. I've had a brilliant, it's morning here, but obviously afternoon, evening in India. It's been so nice to talk to you, and thank you so much for the invitation. And hopefully before too long, I will be able to come back to Hyderabad and see many of you in person. That's my deepest wish at the moment.
Yeah, we look forward to welcoming you here.
Thank you.
Yeah, certainly we are looking forward to meeting you in person very soon, Adeni. Yeah, thank you
Thank
all
you
of you.
so much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.